He believed he had built an empire where nothing escaped his notice. But on one unforgettable autumn evening, the greatest mistake of his life stood quietly in front of him wearing a black housekeeping uniform. Golden light spilled through the towering windows of the Callahan estate, painting long shadows across polished marble floors that reflected crystal chandeliers worth more than most families would earn in a lifetime. Every guest admired the mansion as if it were a museum, every servant moved with silent precision, and every conversation softened whenever Adrian Callahan entered the room. At 43, the White Mafia Boss carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who had spent decades making impossible decisions without raising his voice. His tailored black suit fit perfectly against his broad frame. His dark brown hair was brushed neatly back with streaks of natural gray that only strengthened his commanding presence, and the intricate black and gray tattoos disappearing beneath the open collar of his black dress shirt reminded everyone that elegance and danger could exist in the same person. Across the room, Simone Brooks quietly adjusted the silver serving tray in her hands before offering warm cider to the guests. At 30 years old, she had become nearly invisible to those who believed uniforms erased identities. Her rich ebony brown skin glowed beneath the chandelier light, her graceful posture reflected quiet dignity, and her gentle smile remained unchanged despite years of hearing people speak around her rather than to her. Few people knew she had memorized every corner of the mansion after 6 years of devoted work. Even fewer noticed the way she always kept one eye on 11-year-old Ethan Callahan, Adrian's only son. The boy wandered through the crowded library with the restless curiosity of childhood, slipping away from conversations filled with business deals and expensive laughter. While adults admired antique paintings and rare sculptures collected from around the world, Ethan discovered an old brass compass resting beside an enormous porcelain vase displayed on a carved oak pedestal. He reached carefully toward the compass, but his sleeve brushed the edge of the heavy vase. Time seemed to hesitate. The priceless porcelain tilted once, then again, before crashing onto the marble floor with a sharp explosion that silenced every conversation in the mansion. Hundreds of white fragments scattered across the polished stone. Crystal glasses stopped halfway to waiting lips. Musicians lowered their instruments. Even the fireplace seemed quieter. Ethan stood frozen, his face drained of color as tears gathered in frightened eyes. Adrian turned immediately toward the sound. Every guest followed his gaze. No one noticed the terrified boy except Simone. Without the slightest hesitation, she stepped forward and placed herself between Ethan and the shattered remains. She lowered her eyes, folded her trembling hands in front of her apron, and spoke with a calm voice that carried through the silent room. "I am so sorry. It was my mistake." Ethan stared at her in disbelief. Adrian's expression hardened. Around the library, whispers spread almost instantly. Some guests shook their heads with disappointment, while others exchanged knowing looks, convinced that carelessness had finally revealed itself. Simone never looked toward the boy she had just protected. She accepted every judgment in complete silence, her breathing steady despite the weight of countless eyes resting upon her. Adrian slowly approached the broken porcelain, then lifted his gaze toward the woman who had served his family with unwavering loyalty for years. The room waited for his verdict, and somewhere behind Simone, a frightened child realized that the most extraordinary act of courage he would ever witness had begun with 4 quiet words that no one else would ever understand. Adrian Callahan did not raise his voice, and that frightened people far more than anger ever could. He looked down at the shattered porcelain, then back at Simone Brooks with the same unreadable expression that had settled countless business disputes inside the city without a single unnecessary word. The vase had belonged to his late mother, one of the last pieces she had personally chosen before illness took her years earlier. It had never been measured by its auction value alone. It represented memory, family, and a promise that some things inside the mansion would never change. "Come with me," he said quietly. Simone nodded without resistance. She followed him through the library while dozens of curious eyes tracked every step she took. Ethan remained frozen beside the broken pedestal, his small hands trembling as he watched the woman disappear behind the heavy walnut doors. He wanted to speak. Every part of him wanted to shout the truth. Yet fear wrapped itself around his chest so tightly that no words escaped. Inside Adrian's private office, warm light from the fireplace softened shelves lined with leather-bound books and old family photographs. Simone stood with perfect posture near the doorway, her hands folded calmly despite the uncertainty ahead. Adrian remained silent for several moments before turning toward her. "You have worked in this house for 6 years," he said. "You have never made a mistake like this before." Simone lowered her eyes. "There is a first time for everyone." Adrian studied her face carefully. Something about her answer did not fit. She was honest by nature. Everyone who worked in the estate knew it. Yet tonight her voice carried an unusual weight, as though every word had been chosen long before the accident itself. "Was anyone else involved?" he asked. For the briefest instant, Simone's eyes drifted toward the family portrait resting on the desk. Ethan smiled brightly in the photograph beside his father, unaware that a single decision made in childhood could echo across decades. She looked back at Adrian and answered with quiet certainty. "No, sir. I was careless." Adrian nodded slowly, disappointment replacing suspicion. "Then I cannot overlook it." Simone accepted the words before he finished speaking. "I understand." There was no pleading, no explanation, no attempt to defend herself. That unexpected dignity unsettled Adrian more than excuses would have. He opened a drawer, removed an envelope containing several weeks of severance pay, and placed it gently on the desk. "You have always served this family faithfully," he said. "But I cannot ask the staff or my guests to ignore what happened tonight." Simone looked at the envelope but made no move to touch it. Instead, she offered a grateful smile that seemed strangely peaceful for someone watching her future disappear. "Thank you for giving me the opportunity to work here." Adrian frowned slightly. Most people argued when their lives changed in an instant. She simply thanked him. She picked up the envelope, turned toward the door, then paused with her hand resting lightly on the brass handle. Without looking back, she said, "Please be patient with children, Mr. Callahan. Sometimes they carry burdens that adults never notice." Before Adrian could ask what she meant, she quietly left the office. Upstairs, Ethan watched from the second-floor balcony as Simone crossed the enormous front hall carrying only her small handbag and the envelope that represented the end of 6 faithful years. She never looked back at the mansion. She never searched for sympathy. The front door closed softly behind her, and in that gentle sound, a frightened boy felt the first unbearable weight of a secret that would follow him long after the broken porcelain had been forgotten by everyone except the 3 people whose lives it had silently changed. The hardest promises to keep are the ones that no one else knows exist. Simone Brooks rented a small apartment above a neighborhood grocery store on the east side of the city, where the sounds of delivery trucks replaced the quiet fountains and trimmed gardens she had known for years at the Callahan estate. The apartment measured barely 500 square feet, with faded wooden floors that creaked beneath every careful step and a single window overlooking rows of brick buildings that caught the morning sunlight for only a few precious minutes each day. She unpacked her belongings without complaint. A few books, neatly folded clothes, framed photographs of her late grandmother, and a ceramic coffee mug with a tiny crack along the handle filled most of the room. The envelope Adrian had given her remained untouched on the kitchen table until she carefully deposited the money into her savings account, determined to stretch every dollar for as long as possible. Finding work proved harder than she expected. Several homeowners recognized her name after hearing whispers from employees who had attended the gathering at the Callahan mansion. They remembered only the broken porcelain, never the years of flawless service that came before it. Interviews ended with polite smiles and promises that never became phone calls. Simone thanked each person sincerely before walking back onto busy sidewalks where strangers hurried past without noticing the quiet dignity in her steady stride. Weeks became months. She accepted temporary cleaning jobs at churches, community centers, and small offices that paid by the hour. Every paycheck covered only the essentials, yet she still found ways to help others. An elderly neighbor recovering from surgery often discovered fresh groceries outside her apartment door without knowing who had left them. A single mother working 2 jobs returned home one evening to find her laundry neatly folded after Simone quietly offered to help while watching the children for an hour. She never expected recognition. Kindness, to her, was not a performance. It was simply the way she believed people should live. Across town, Ethan Callahan could not escape the memory of the library. Every time he walked past the empty pedestal where the porcelain vase had once stood, guilt settled deeper inside him. He replayed the accident again and again, remembering Simone stepping in front of him before anyone else had even realized what happened. More than once he walked toward his father's office, determined to confess everything, but each time he stopped outside the closed door. Adrian seemed consumed by expanding his business empire, attending meetings, hosting charity galas, and making decisions that affected thousands of employees. Ethan convinced himself that telling the truth now would only reopen an old wound. As the years quietly passed, silence became easier to maintain but impossible to forget. Adrian occasionally noticed small reminders of Simone throughout the estate. The library books remained arranged exactly as she had organized them. The greenhouse flowers she once cared for continued blooming every spring because she had created a maintenance journal so detailed that new employees still followed it page by page. Even the kitchen staff admitted that no one prepared his mother's favorite apple pie quite the way Simone had. He never spoke her name aloud, yet unexpected memories appeared in ordinary moments like distant echoes refusing to disappear. Meanwhile, Simone built a simple life grounded not in comfort but in character, carrying a secret that grew heavier with every passing year, never realizing that somewhere across the city, the frightened little boy she had protected was slowly becoming a man haunted by 4 quiet words that had saved him and quietly rewritten all 3 of their lives. Nearly 15 years passed before the house finally decided to give back the truth it had been quietly hiding. The Callahan estate was undergoing its first major restoration in decades after a winter storm damaged part of the old West Wing. Contractors carefully removed built-in shelves from a storage room that had remained locked since Adrian's mother passed away, uncovering forgotten boxes coated with years of dust. Most contained faded holiday decorations, old accounting records, and family keepsakes that no one had touched in years. Then one carpenter carried out a small cedar box with brass corners that had slipped behind a cabinet long ago. There was no label, only a tiny paper crane tucked beneath the weathered ribbon tied around it. The house manager placed the box inside Adrian's study, assuming it belonged with the family's personal belongings. That evening, after another exhausting day of meetings, Adrian loosened the collar of his black shirt and sat alone behind his desk. He opened the cedar box without much expectation, thinking it contained old letters from his parents. Instead, he found a child's wooden toy car, a stack of neatly folded drawings, a small digital camcorder, and an envelope with handwriting he recognized immediately. Simone Brooks. For the first time in many years, her name rested silently before him instead of lingering only in memory. His fingers hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside was a single handwritten note. The words were brief, written with careful penmanship. "If this is ever found, I hope the truth arrives only when it can heal instead of destroy." Adrian frowned. Nothing about the message made sense. He reached for the old camcorder, surprised that its battery still accepted a charge after connecting it to a power cable found in the same box. The screen flickered several times before revealing grainy footage recorded inside the mansion library. The date displayed in the corner stopped Adrian's breathing for an instant. It was the same evening the porcelain vase had shattered. The camera had apparently been left recording by Ethan while experimenting with the device earlier that afternoon. The recording showed empty bookshelves, distant conversations, and guests walking in and out of view. Then young Ethan wandered into the frame, curiously examining the antique compass beside the porcelain vase. Adrian leaned closer to the screen. His heartbeat slowed as every forgotten second unfolded exactly as it had happened. Ethan reached toward the compass. His sleeve accidentally brushed the vase. The porcelain tipped, balanced for one impossible moment, then crashed onto the marble floor. Before anyone entered the frame, Simone rushed toward the frightened boy. She knelt beside him, gently placed both hands on his shoulders, and spoke words the old microphone barely captured. Listen to me. Do not say anything. Let me take care of this. Ethan shook his head, tears filling his young eyes. Simone smiled softly despite the chaos surrounding them. Your father already carries enough. He should not have to watch you blame yourself for this too. Seconds later the guests rushed into the room exactly as Adrian remembered. Simone stepped forward. She accepted responsibility before anyone asked a single question. The recording ended there. Adrian remained motionless, staring at the frozen image on the tiny screen. Every certainty he had carried for 15 years quietly collapsed inside the silence of his study. The woman he believed had failed his family had instead protected it at the greatest cost to herself, and for the first time since that autumn evening, the most powerful man in the room found himself unable to look away from the truth. Adrian watched the recording 3 more times before dawn, hoping that somewhere between one frame and the next the truth would change into something easier to bear. It never did. Every replay only sharpened the painful clarity of Simone Brooks stepping forward with quiet determination, while his terrified son stood safely behind her. For 15 years he had believed he was protecting the integrity of his home by making a difficult decision. Instead, he had punished the one person who had protected his family without asking for anything in return. The first rays of morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of his study, illuminating the old family portrait on his desk. Adrian looked at the smiling faces frozen in time and suddenly realized there had been one person missing from the photograph all along. Not because she was unimportant, but because people like Simone were too often expected to stand behind the camera instead of beside the family they quietly held together. He picked up the handwritten note again and read every word with slower eyes. I hope the truth arrives only when it can heal instead of destroy. Those words revealed more about Simone than any conversation they had ever shared. She had never intended to expose Ethan. She had never planned to defend herself. She had carried the burden because she believed protecting a frightened child mattered more than protecting her own reputation. Adrian leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, remembering details that had seemed meaningless years earlier. Her calm acceptance. Her refusal to argue. Her final request for patience with children. None of it had been mysterious. The truth had been standing directly in front of him, but he had been too certain of his own judgment to recognize it. A soft knock interrupted the silence. Ethan, now 26 years old, stepped into the study after noticing the light beneath the door. Years had transformed the frightened boy into a thoughtful young man, yet Adrian immediately recognized the same uneasy expression he had seen in the library all those years ago. Without speaking, Adrian turned the camcorder toward his son and pressed play. Ethan watched the screen in complete silence. His shoulders slowly lowered as though the invisible weight he had carried for half his life had finally become visible to someone else. When the recording ended, neither man spoke for several long moments. Finally, Ethan whispered, I wanted to tell you every day. Adrian looked at his son, not with anger, but with overwhelming sadness. Why did you not? Ethan struggled to answer. The longer I waited, the harder it became. Every year I thought I had already waited too long. Then I convinced myself she had probably moved on and that confessing would only hurt everyone again. But I never stopped thinking about her. Adrian nodded slowly. He understood that silence had imprisoned them both in different ways. He stood and walked toward the library, stopping before the empty pedestal where the porcelain vase had once stood. For years he had blamed that broken space on a careless mistake. Now he understood it represented something far greater. It was a monument to his own failure to see character beyond circumstance. He rested his hand lightly on the polished wood and spoke almost to himself. A priceless vase can be replaced. A person's dignity cannot. Ethan remained beside him, unable to look away from the empty pedestal that had shaped both of their lives. In the quiet stillness of the mansion, father and son finally shared the same truth, and Adrian made a decision that neither wealth nor influence could accomplish for him unless he first found the woman whose quiet sacrifice had preserved his family while quietly costing her everything. The search began without bodyguards, without headlines, and without the authority that usually opened every locked door for Adrian Callahan. For the first time in many years, he wanted answers that money alone could not buy. He started with the old employment records stored in the estate archives, following addresses that had long since been replaced by new tenants and renovated buildings. The apartment above the neighborhood grocery store had been converted into 2 smaller units. The elderly landlord remembered Simone immediately, not because of the scandal that had ended her employment, but because she had spent every Saturday carrying groceries upstairs for residents whose knees no longer allowed them to climb comfortably. She always paid her rent on time, the landlord said with a gentle smile. But what I remember most is that she never let anyone feel embarrassed for needing help. Adrian thanked him quietly before returning to his car, carrying a heavier heart than when he had arrived. The next stop was a small community church where Simone had accepted cleaning work years earlier. The pastor welcomed Adrian politely, unaware of the connection between the wealthy businessman and the woman whose name still appeared on volunteer lists long after she had stopped working there. She came here before sunrise, the pastor explained. She finished every task before the children arrived for school. Then she stayed to read with students who struggled. Nobody asked her to. She simply noticed they needed someone patient. Adrian looked around the modest classroom where colorful drawings covered the walls. He found it difficult to imagine that the woman he had dismissed had quietly shaped dozens of young lives while asking for nothing in return. As the days passed, each conversation revealed another piece of a life he had never taken the time to understand. A nurse at a neighborhood clinic remembered Simone bringing homemade soup to patients who lived alone. The owner of a small bookstore smiled while describing how she organized free reading afternoons for children during the summer. A retired school crossing guard laughed softly while recalling how Simone carried extra umbrellas in her car so children would not walk home in the rain. Every story sounded different, yet they all ended the same way. She had helped because she believed kindness should never depend on recognition. Adrian realized something that unsettled him more than any business failure he had ever faced. During all the years he had measured people by loyalty, efficiency, and performance, Simone had quietly measured life by compassion. Late one afternoon, Ethan joined his father outside the bookstore after reading through another notebook, filled with names and addresses connected to Simone's volunteer work. "Did everyone know her like this?" he asked. Adrian looked across the street where parents were walking hand in hand with their children beneath the warm afternoon sun. "No," he answered softly. "Everyone knew a different part of her. I never bothered to know any part at all." The bookstore owner stepped outside carrying an old customer registration card. "You are looking for Miss Brooks, are you not?" she asked. Adrian nodded. The woman smiled gently before pointing toward a nearby suburb about 20 miles away. "She moved several years ago. She teaches reading classes twice a week at the neighborhood community center there. If you arrive before sunset on Thursdays, you might still find her." Adrian folded the card carefully into his jacket pocket. After 15 years of carrying the wrong judgment, the road toward the right one had finally appeared, and for the first time since watching the forgotten recording, hope quietly replaced regret as father and son drove together toward the place where the woman they had both been searching for had unknowingly continued changing lives with the same quiet grace she had always carried. The community center stood at the end of a quiet tree-lined street where children rode bicycles across cracked sidewalks and neighbors greeted one another by name. It was nothing like the towering Callahan estate, yet the peaceful laughter drifting through the open windows gave the modest brick building a warmth that no amount of luxury could imitate. Adrian parked across the street and remained seated for several moments, staring through the windshield. For decades he had walked into boardrooms without hesitation, negotiated impossible agreements, and faced powerful rivals with unwavering confidence. Yet stepping through one simple doorway suddenly felt more difficult than anything his wealth or influence had ever demanded. Ethan rested a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder before they quietly entered the building. Soft voices echoed from a classroom where a dozen children sat around folding tables with colorful books spread before them. At the front of the room stood Simone Brooks. Time had added quiet maturity to her graceful features, but it had never diminished the warmth in her gentle smile or the calm dignity in her posture. She moved from child to child with patient encouragement, celebrating every correctly read sentence as though it were the greatest achievement in the world. Adrian watched silently from the hallway, realizing that she carried herself exactly as she had inside his mansion many years earlier. Her surroundings had changed, but her character had not. When the lesson ended, the children thanked her one by one before hurrying outside to waiting parents. Simone gathered the books carefully, humming softly to herself as she arranged them on a shelf. Only then did she notice the two familiar figures standing quietly near the doorway. Her hands paused for just a moment before she offered the same warm smile she had always given others. "Mr. Callahan," she said gently. "It has been a long time." Adrian opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Every carefully rehearsed apology disappeared beneath the weight of the moment. Finally he managed to say, "I know the truth." Simone looked at him calmly without surprise. It was almost as though she had expected this day to arrive eventually. Ethan stepped forward first, his voice trembling despite the years that had passed. "It was me. I broke the vase. I should have told him that night. I should have told everyone." Tears filled his eyes as he lowered his head. "I am sorry. I have been sorry every day." Simone crossed the room slowly and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, just as she had done when he was an 11-year-old boy trembling beside shattered porcelain. "You were a frightened child," she said softly. "Children deserve guidance, not lifelong guilt." Ethan looked at her in disbelief. "How can you forgive me?" Simone smiled with quiet kindness. "Because carrying anger for 15 years would have been a far heavier burden than carrying the truth." Adrian felt his composure finally break. "I judged you without listening. I destroyed your career. I never even asked the right questions." His voice grew quieter with every word. "There is no excuse for what I did." Simone looked directly into his eyes, seeing not the powerful man the city respected but the father weighed down by sincere regret. "You made a decision with the information you believed was true," she answered gently. "I made mine for the same reason. We both wanted to protect someone we loved." The room fell completely silent. No accusations remained. No bitterness filled the air. Only three people stood together, finally free from the secret that had quietly shaped their lives for 15 years. And in that peaceful silence Adrian discovered that true forgiveness did not erase the past but gave everyone the courage to walk beyond it together. News of Adrian Callahan's public statement spread across the city with surprising speed, not because it involved one of the region's most influential businessmen, but because few people had ever seen him admit that he had been wrong. Standing before community leaders, employees, and local reporters inside the restored library of the Callahan estate, he spoke without prepared notes or carefully polished language. He explained that 15 years earlier he had made a judgment that cost an innocent woman her career and reputation. He accepted full responsibility and announced that every employment record connected to Simone Brooks would be formally corrected to reflect her years of exemplary service. The room remained unusually quiet as he finished speaking. No one applauded immediately. The sincerity in his voice demanded reflection before celebration. Days later Adrian invited Simone back to the estate, not as an employee, but as an honored guest. The mansion looked much the same as it had years before, yet everything felt different. The empty pedestal in the library had been replaced with a handcrafted wooden display bearing a simple bronze plaque. Instead of showcasing an expensive object, it held a framed message that read, "Character is worth more than anything that can be broken." Simone stood silently before it for several moments, her expression thoughtful rather than emotional. Adrian approached her with Ethan beside him. "This house spent too many years remembering the wrong thing," Adrian said quietly. "It is time it remembered the right one." He then introduced a new educational initiative that would provide reading programs, scholarships, and family literacy resources for underserved neighborhoods throughout the city. The foundation would partner with schools, libraries, and community centers where Simone had volunteered for so many years. When the audience heard its official name, many smiled with quiet appreciation. The Simone Brooks Foundation. Every camera in the room turned toward her, waiting for a reaction that never sought attention. Simone looked gently at Adrian before shaking her head with a humble smile. "The children do not need my name," she said softly. "They only need opportunities." Adrian answered with equal sincerity. "Your name reminds us why those opportunities exist." Ethan stepped forward carrying a framed certificate recognizing Simone's years of service to the Callahan family. "This should have been given to you 15 years ago," he said. "It is late, but it is honest." Simone accepted the frame with both hands, not because of the paper itself, but because she could see the peace returning to father and son. Looking around the room, she recognized several former employees from the estate who quietly wiped tears from their eyes. They remembered her kindness from years before and understood that they were witnessing something far greater than a public apology. They were watching dignity restored without bitterness or revenge. As the gathering ended, guests approached Simone one after another, not to praise her sacrifice, but simply to thank her for the countless unseen acts of kindness that had quietly shaped lives beyond the walls of any mansion. Standing beneath the warm afternoon light pouring through the library windows, Adrian realized that the most valuable legacy he could ever leave his family would never be measured by property, influence, or wealth. It would be measured by whether they possessed the humility to correct a wrong when the truth finally found its way home. 1 year later, the first spring festival organized by the Simone Brooks Foundation filled the neighborhood park with families, teachers, volunteers, and children carrying books instead of balloons. The event was simple by design. There were reading circles beneath large oak trees, tables where retired teachers helped students with homework, shelves filled with donated novels, and local musicians performing gentle acoustic songs that blended naturally with the laughter echoing across the grass. Adrian Callahan walked through the park without the distance that had once separated him from ordinary moments. He greeted volunteers by name, carried folding chairs alongside college students, and spent most of the afternoon listening rather than speaking. Ethan stood nearby helping young children choose their first library cards, smiling every time one of them proudly held up a new book. Years earlier he had believed that courage meant hiding his mistakes. Now he understood that courage began the moment someone accepted responsibility for them. Simone arrived quietly, just as she always had, carrying 2 boxes filled with children's picture books she had personally collected from community donations. Several students ran toward her with excited voices, eager to introduce their parents to the woman who had taught them that reading could open doors no key could unlock. She greeted every child by name, remembering birthdays, favorite stories, and even the small victories they had celebrated together throughout the year. Watching from a distance, Adrian finally understood why everyone he had met during his search had spoken about her with such warmth. It had never been because of one extraordinary sacrifice. It was because she treated ordinary people as though they had always mattered. Later that afternoon, a young girl stepped onto the small outdoor stage to read an essay she had written for school. Her voice trembled at first, then grew stronger with every sentence. She spoke about a woman who believed that kindness could change lives even when nobody was watching. She never mentioned expensive homes, powerful families, or long-hidden secrets. She simply described a teacher who showed up every week, listened patiently, encouraged frightened children to believe in themselves, and never asked for recognition. When the applause faded, Simone quietly wiped a tear from the corner of her eye while Ethan smiled with unmistakable pride. Adrian looked around the park and realized that the foundation had already become something much larger than a public apology. It had become a living reminder that one compassionate decision could continue touching lives long after the people involved believed their story had ended. As the evening sun settled behind the trees, casting warm golden light across the gathering, father and son walked beside Simone toward the park entrance. No one hurried to leave. Children sat reading on picnic blankets while parents laughed together nearby. The peaceful scene felt almost impossible to compare with the silent library where everything had begun 15 years earlier. Ethan stopped walking for a moment and looked at Simone. "You gave me a chance to become the man I wanted to be," he said softly. Simone smiled with the same quiet grace she had carried through every chapter of her life. "No," she answered gently. "You became that man the day you chose the truth." Adrian looked at both of them before lifting his eyes toward the families filling the park with hope instead of fear. He finally understood that influence was never measured by how many people obeyed you, but by how many people became better because you chose compassion over pride. The evening breeze carried the sound of children turning pages beneath the fading sunlight, and in that quiet moment the city no longer remembered a broken porcelain vase. It remembered the woman who had protected a child, forgiven a father, restored a family, and reminded everyone that true dignity is never given by power because it has always belonged to those humble enough to protect it.